And the Ospreys welcome us back to Macduff Lives, our show here on YouTube. I'm John OLoughlin. Welcome to the channel and welcome to another reading tonight. I had a change on my schedule this evening. If you check the calendar over at screamingospreys.com, I was supposed to do a minefield tonight, but I used up my brains today already. We did a show with Harley Schlanger, which was very stimulating, and then following that, a show over at Biden Belton Road Show, the new Neighborhood News Hour show over on YouTube, featuring George Webb and Farmer Jones and myself and Aaron Adler, and we had a fascinating discussion about the proprieties and improprieties surrounding this purported impeachment um, show that's going on right now. Well, I think I used up all my front end lobe brain cells, and I'm just going to be a reader for you tonight because I think that the best thing we can do with this time here is to keep pushing with the DeMohrenschildt story. Seems to have fallen in my lap the past week or so, and to flesh out the relationship between the white Russians, the Rockefellers, the Texas oil people, the CIA, and especially the CIA director, Alan Dulles, is a very important way to tie together the forces that led us to where we are today. So Alan Dulles and George DeMohrenschildt. Dulles, DeMohrenschildt, and oil. And this is part 2 of my reading of chapter 3 of the book, JFK versus Alan Dulles, Battleground Indonesia by Dr. Greg Poulgrain. We were talking about Count Kotzebue, Kotzebue, who was a baron, that minor Russian nobility, and involved in the oil business. I'll pick up here where they spoke about how both Alan Dulles and George DeMohrenschildt each had forebears who were involved in the American Revolution. And other than that, of course, they have that kind of somewhat aristocratic lineage that goes way, way back. DeMohrenschildt in Russia and Dulles in America, both in New England and before that in South Carolina, and his family having been traced back to Scotland, where the original name was actually Douglas, and it became pronounced Dulles, and then the spelling changed. It's funny how those things happen. Well, he was interviewed by an attorney named Jenner in the Warren Commission hearings, and that's the man whose name is mentioned in this text. And here we start here. I'll just pick up where we were. As he told Jenner, well then, having had the background of the oil industry in my blood, because my father was the director of Nobel Enterprises, I decided to come and try to work for an oil company in America. Nobel Enterprises was the managing enterprise of the Baku oil fields under the Romanov dynasty. When we look more closely at George's employment in the oil industry in the 1940s and 50s and how it was linked with Alan Dulles, it raises the possibility that a helping hand was given earlier by Dulles during the 1930s. At the same time as George was completing his university studies and running a sports business with the help of his girlfriend, Alan Dulles was based in Paris. As the Sullivan and Cromwell representative in Europe, he also became a director or established a close association with the board of directors of some German banks and companies, such as Schroders and IG Farben, which had American subsidiaries. During the decade before World War II, Dulles was establishing many such contacts, which he utilized during the war for intelligence purposes. In the 1930s, when George DeMohrenschildt was in Antwerp and Liège, Dulles was building his networks. He was already in the process of constructing the foundations of the legend. Between 1928 and 1936, Dulles went to many parts of Europe for numerous international conferences, such as naval disarmament, arms limitation, or business legal conferences. His roles remained interchangeable between the State Department and Sullivan and Cromwell, still the front desk of Standard Oil. John Foster Dulles was now running the Wall Street legal firm. Allen Dulles often traveled from Paris to London or Geneva, or to Berlin or Budapest. In Paris, which was only a few hours' travel from where George was staying, Allen frequently went to a kitschy Montmartre bistro, the Scheherazade, a favorite haunt for the Russian noble folk. When Allen and Clover, with 3 children, stayed in Paris for a year from May 1930, Gross comments that Allen would often take Clover or other companions to the Scheherazade, and years later he was still in the habit of visiting the same bistro and mixing with the Russian émigré community. Because of the rapport he had established in the 1920s with some of the leading Russians in the White Army, such as Wrangel, Kutepov, and Sergius von Mohrenschildt, Dulles had credibility with the Russian émigré community in Paris. While Dulles was listening to Cossack songs in the Scheherazade, he was also cultivating friendships. Although there is no documented or photographic evidence of any meeting at the Scheherazade between Allen Dulles and George DeMohrenschildt, it certainly provided an excellent opportunity for this to occur. Another Russian émigré Dulles befriended was Count Paul de Kotzebue, that's Kotzebue, who had served as an officer in the Tsar's Imperial Guard before the Revolution. 2 previous generations of his family line had attained the rank of general in the Russian army. While living as an émigré in Paris in 1934, Kotzebue was officially bestowed with Russian nobility as a count. He was 50 years of age and still single, but a year or so later, in March 1936, in Geneva, he was married to Aline Tew, T-E-W, the richest woman in the United States, and 2 years later emigrated to live with his wife. The Count and Countess arrived at Palm Beach on January 12, 1938. For 11 years, until 1953, he was president of the Russian Nobility Association, founded in New York City 2 decades earlier. The uncle of Count Kotzebue had been the Russian ambassador in Washington when Allen's grandfather, John W. Foster, was Secretary of State. Previously, Foster had been the U.S. ambassador in Tsarist Russia, based in St. Petersburg. With Count Kotzebue's family background and his former position in the Tsar's Imperial Guard, he would have known the person responsible for mobilizing the Tsar's army, Sergius von Mohrenschildt. Furthermore, as a result of émigrés establishing their own networks after the Russian Revolution, Count Paul de Kotzebue would have known that both Sergius and George were among those who had managed to escape. Allen Dulles was well placed to make these connections. Even the Paris residence where he and Clover were staying was in close proximity, several hundred meters, to the residence of Kotzebue. Aline Tew. In the period leading up to war in Europe in 1939, Allen Dulles carried out the business of Sullivan and Cromwell. In addition to Standard Oil, he was the European representative of a host of worldwide companies, such as the U.S. subsidiary of IG Farben and General Electric. Colonel Fletcher Prouty commented on this German link, and now quoting, "The Sullivan and Cromwell offices had the major U.S. legal contacts in Germany during the Hitler period. We couldn't say they were essentially pro-Nazi, but they didn't close their offices in Germany until well after the start of World War II. The fact that they were still there during the war became quite an embarrassment to the U.S. government. To think that here we were, very anti-Hitler, anti-Axis, and yet this major U.S. law firm was still operating there. This law firm was in a sense dominated by these Dulles brothers, whose idea of international affairs and international business was shaped by the law firm's clientele and by their own global activities." Pardon me. Now, somebody sent me a note on 2 days ago and told me that I was a British hater, a hater of Great Britain. And I just think that, how could anybody think such a thing? Because if it weren't for Great Britain, there would not be Belvoir organic ginger beer. That's my drink of choice, Belvoir organic ginger beer. And that comes from the great country of Great Britain. I love Great Britain. I don't have any reason why somebody would say such an awful and vicious thing. But rest assured, Great Britain, I love you. Belvoir, you're the best. So I hope that puts that question to rest. One of Standard Oil's main goals, as shown by the constant proposals for oil exploration permits since World War I, was to gain access to the East Indies and especially the untouched territory of Netherlands, New Guinea. Within a decade of Allen Dulles's joining Sullivan and Cromwell, he had successfully secured Dutch agreement for NNGPM, the 60-40 U.S.-Dutch company, to begin oil exploration in New Guinea. Before World War I, Standard Oil of New Jersey had wanted concessions in Sumatra, but the Dutch did not want to let in Rockefeller. Even when Jersey established a Dutch company, NKPM, the Dutch continued to shun all applications until 1928, thus ending Jersey's battle of a third of a century to obtain direct grants of concession in the Dutch East Indies. When they say Jersey, they mean Standard Oil of New Jersey, of course. 7 years later, Dulles's NNGPM deal was even better for Standard Oil. Although it had a Dutch name, it was not a Dutch company. The key to achieving this had been Dulles's political intelligence. But rather than rest on his laurels, he began to work on various ways of achieving unfettered access for Standard Oil in the Indies. Dutch authority throughout the archipelago had become culturally embedded to various degrees over 3 centuries. One result of this long colonial presence was that official Dutch representatives in the Indies were comparatively few in number. Yet even small villages in Java celebrated official Dutch occasions, such as the Queen's birthday or a special occasion such as the marriage of Princess Juliana. Official announcements were heralded by the blast of a trumpet from a Dutchman or on a horseback. The message in Dutch, read out by another in a magnificently plumed hat, served to remind all that ultimate colonial authority emanated from a faraway place called Den Haag, the Hague. Dulles' expertise on monarchy and regime change had begun with his very first appointment in the State Department. A decade and a half later, he was still dealing with European empires and monarchical power, now focusing on the Netherlands East Indies. He fully appreciated how power was equated with royalty and, more important, how a change in ruler can effectively achieve a quick and effective transformation of power. Dulles' network included Aline II, or rather Countess Kotzebue, especially in the 1936 to 38 period when she was still in Paris, before she and her husband moved to the United States and bought the residence of Vincent Astor on 9 acres at Newport, Rhode Island, in October of 1940. Aline Ii's wealth came mostly from her third husband, who had been a top executive in General Electric, then in the top level of the world's largest companies, as it still is today. Sullivan and Cromwell had been an integral part of General Electric since its inception half a century earlier. In addition, Aline Ii's fourth marriage, 1929 to 35, which ended in divorce, highlighted an aspect of Dutch politics that coincided with Dulles' specialized area of interest. Her former husband, Prince Heinrich XXXIII Reuss, who was related to the German husband of Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, was for a time considered heir to the Dutch throne. Only after 8 difficult years that included several miscarriages and a stillbirth was Wilhelmina's first and only child born, Juliana, who became the heir apparent. She replaced Heinrich as the person in line to become the next Dutch monarch. A generation later, however, a young German prince named Bernhard, from the region of Lippe-Biesterfeld, reawakened the possibility of marrying into the Dutch throne. After World War I, Bernhard was living with his parents near the Polish border, the family fortune lost, and their title the only remaining vestige of the former claim they had to dynastic privilege. After completing language studies at Berlin's Humboldt University with a special interest in state affairs and politics, Prince Bernhard briefly went to England in 1935, the year after his father died, and then began working for I.G. Farben. By the following year, in the Paris office in Avenue Hoche, he was the secretary to the board of directors that was headed by Dr. Willibald Passarge. As a distant relative of Kotzebue, Bernhard became the relative in residence of the newly married couple and was virtually adopted by the Countess Aline, now 64 years of age. For whatever reason, she treated him as her son. Bernhard was 25 years old, the same age as Aline Ii's first son when he was killed as a pilot in World War I by one of Germany's top air aces. Bernhard had distant family connections with Aline Ii's fourth husband, Prince Heinrich, who also was linked with Lippe-Biesterfeld, so her role could be described as a distant aunt. Whether she saw her role as aunt or mother, her wealth permitted Bernhard on his fixed salary to live the life of a playboy. His age, his good looks, and the fact that Bernhard had already been trained as a pilot, which seemed to complete his role as the lost son, all contributed to Aline Ii's willingness to lavish money on him. When Dr. Passarge expressed admiration for a state-of-the-art Mercedes-Benz belonging to the King of Spain, Bernhard purchased it with Aline Ii's money and then arranged an exchange for the Chrysler that Passarge used in Paris. While it might have seemed as though the prince from a nearly forgotten corner of Germany had aspirations above himself, This level of social extravagance helped only to promote Bernhard's eligibility in terms of the woman he was soon destined to meet, Juliana, daughter of Wilhelmina. As Sullivan and Cromwell's representative of I.G. Farben operations in the United States, Allen Dulles was directly linked with I.G. Farben's Paris-based operations. Whether Dulles' acquaintance with Prince Bernhard was through his own links with I.G. Farben or through Count Kotzebue and Aline Chu, the link between the two strengthened as World War II grew nearer. It was a strange coincidence that, until the birth of Princess Juliana, Aline Chu's former husband was first in line for the Dutch throne, and now she was the surrogate mother of Prince Bernhard, who was to marry that same Dutch princess. Juliana and Bernhard were first brought together by means of an arranged meeting that occurred at the Winter Olympics of 1936. Despite reports at that time that the person responsible for this matchmaking was either Ambassador Loudon from the Dutch embassy in Paris or the director of I.G. Farben in Paris, the person who was really in a prime position to arrange such a meeting was Allen Dulles in Paris. Juliana and Bernhard were married in January 1937, and Aline, too, was the godmother of their first child, Beatrix. Pardon me. Hey, John Wilkins, I see you're asking about Toto. Well, I think Toto's upstairs watching television right now with Mom, so probably too far away to hear me mention that odious name. But I'm glad you thought of Toto. Princess Juliana and Prince Bernhard. So this Prince Bernhard is one of those people that's very, very influential in a very negative way over the world in World War II and after World War II. So this part of the story is also, it's just quite an amazing collection of characters, is it not? All jammed into chapter 3 of JFK versus Allen Dulles. This next section is called Vichy Viceroy. The emergence of Bernhard on the political stage at this time needs to be seen in the context of the proposal that he should be, quote, Viceroy of the Netherlands East Indies. This never came about, but can be seen as a moment in Indies history whereby Allen Dulles attempted what is now termed regime change. Anti-colonialism in the Indies had been forcefully subdued in the 1920s. And in the 30s, the colonial authorities had exiled the prominent Indonesian nationalists to remote parts of the archipelago. Sukarno was sent to Flores, and then Bengkulu on the southwest coast of Sumatra. Hatta and Syahrir went to the Boven Jogel camp in Netherlands, New Guinea for 1 year, and then to the small island of Bandaria. As well as this internal pressure on the authorities to implement change, there was also external pressure in the 1930s from Germany and then Japan. The respective governments in both countries expressed strong interest in Netherlands, New Guinea. The significant development that occurred in 1935 in direct response to the Japanese was when Allen Dulles secured Dutch agreement for NNGPM to begin oil exploration immediately. While helping to assuage Dutch concerns over their inability to assert sovereignty of the territory when faced with unauthorized incursion by Japanese oil exploration, The deal with Dulles was like letting in a wolf to act as a guard dog. It was only a matter of time before it attacked the owner. Although the Dutch had already granted smaller leases to a Japanese company to harvest forest products, in February 1937 the Japanese parliament opened discussions leasing the New Guinea territory in its entirety. Had news about the gold discovery by Jean-Jacques Dozy somehow leaked further than the NNGPM? The Japanese, whether deliberately or inadvertently, highlighted the Dutch claim to sovereignty as fragile and specious at a time when actual control over the vast country was minimal. There were two important American expeditions into the Netherlands, New Guinea, one in 1937 and the other in 1938. In the first, the Denison Crockett Ornithological Expedition, Sidney Dillon Ripley was the zoologist. During the early war years, he worked with Allen Dulles in the Rockefeller Center in British Security Coordination. During the war, he was in the OSS, in charge of intelligence in the New Guinea, Indonesia region. The other expedition in 1938 was led by Richard Archbold, grandson of a former president of Standard Oil. He had visited the eastern half of the island twice before attempting the western half, which was totally unknown territory. The U.S. Navy provided the most modern PBY Catalina flying boat available, and this allowed exploration of the West New Guinea highlands by landing on various large lakes. Archbold described the landscape and people from the Dani tribe as in an idyllic setting, dubbing it Shangri-La. Papuan men, women, and children worked acres of highly cultivated fields until mid-afternoon. When the women returned to the village to cook, the men took care of the children, washing them in the river and providing several hours of school before returning to the village for the evening meal. Sponsorship for the expedition was by the American Museum of Natural History, with prominent names such as Aldrich, Bunker, Ellsworth, Morgan, and Rockefeller. Apart from the Japanese and American interest, there was a long-standing German interest in Netherlands, New Guinea. This was reactivated in 1936 by a leasehold inquiry that involved a close friend of Dulles. The U.S. ambassador to Berlin, William E. Dodd, noted in his diary that he had discussed a German lease over Netherlands, New Guinea with Hjalmar Schacht, the German economist who was Hitler's Minister of Economics and president of the Reichsbank. And by the way, those of you who watched us with Harley Schlanger this morning remember his mention of Schacht economics, and that, of course, is this very same Hjalmar Schacht. Dodd neglected to mention or was not aware of the close link between Schacht and Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, which had existed since the Versailles Treaty. When Dulles had spoken with Adolf Hitler in April 1933, Schacht, as the key financial advisor for the Third Reich, was one of the German banking friends whom Dulles had also visited while in Berlin. Still focusing on Netherlands, New Guinea, Dulles had influence in a UK-based group known as the Cliveden Set, which was formed around the wealthy Astor family, the British wing of the same American family of which Vincent Astor was a prominent member. The Cliveden Set, the name coming from their country residence, was well represented in the British Parliament and strongly in favor of appeasing Hitler's demands by offering him colonial territory. The Netherlands, New East Indies, and parts thereof were specifically mentioned. In February 1938, the British Foreign Secretary and former Viceroy of India, Edward Wood, also known as Lord Halifax, expressed support for the German claim to Netherlands, New Guinea. Closely allied with the Cliveden Set, Wood had just returned from visiting Hitler and Goering. Prince Bernhard, too, had met with Hitler after his engagement to Princess Juliana, which placed the German prince in a position of extraordinary power in relation to the Netherlands East Indies. The Indies contained all the resources Hitler declared the new Reich needed, and similarly for the Japanese, the Indies' oil production was then 8 times the volume of Japan's annual usage, and increased oil for Japan was of strategic importance to supply its imperial army at war with China. Pardon me. Pro-Nazi political sentiment in the Indies was rapidly gaining popularity in the immediate post-war period. The possibility that this new political force would soon have sufficient power to take control of the Indies government was given a distinct boost by the marriage of Bernhard and Juliana. An enormous diamond was given as a wedding present from the people of the Indies. It was Governor General B.C. de Jong who organized the gift. 18 months earlier, the same Governor General had welcomed Anton Mussert, leader of Dutch National Socialists, the pro-Nazi party in the Netherlands, known as the NSB. Mussert's visit to the Indies received not one but two official welcomes, which made de Jong's political sympathy clear to all. He and Mussert wanted to clamp down further on Indonesian nationalism, and so did the Dutch and German business community of the Indies. The actual strength of the pro-Nazi support in the Indies can be judged by a 1940 Australian intelligence report. It was written when war with Japan seemed inevitable because the U.S. embargo on oil exports jeopardized Japan's strategic position in the war with China. The report noted that the government in Batavia considered the likelihood of a coup d'etat by pro-Nazi supporters an even greater threat than the impending Japanese move southward. This possible coup was nipped in the bud as soon as Germany invaded the Netherlands on May the 10th, 1940. The Australian government commission in the Netherlands East Indies reported that 4,000 Nazi followers, mainly Dutch National Socialists, had been interned. Lieutenant Colonel Chapman of Australian military intelligence explained that a coup was prevented only because Dutch security took swift action as soon as they received news of the German invasion, before the Nazi followers in the Indies had time to act. This brief period in the Indies, when the NSB was strong enough to seize power, has largely been forgotten because war soon began in the Pacific, effectively marking the end of 350 years of Dutch presence in the archipelago. Dulles was monitoring events as they occurred, sometimes making them occur, in contact with the political and military hierarchy in Germany, Japan, and the United States. Compared with Dulles's activities during and after the war, his activities before the war have not been so well documented. His role leading up to World War II has a notable lack of transparency, particularly his association with Prince Bernhard before and after the marriage to Juliana. It was during this time, before the war, or before Nazi Germany occupied the Netherlands, that a proposal to make Bernhard Viceroy of the Indies was floated. Yet some Dutch researchers claim it was after the war that Bernhard sought American assistance, Dulles in particular, as part of an ambitious plan to become Viceroy of the Indies. This needs closer inspection, because it could have been achieved before the war, but not after the war, and certainly not after the struggle for Indonesian independence, as such a role then would have been utterly incongruous. Bernhard's covert backing of anti-Indonesian activities after the war may well have become entangled as in a renewed viceroy proposal, but from the American perspective, his plan was never going to happen. His viceroyship before the war was a distinct possibility only because pro-Nazi sentiment in the Indies was so strong. And he quotes supporting documentation for a post-war viceroy for all the Indies must be regarded with extreme skepticism. In the post-war context, this was utterly impracticable. Even if the viceroy's suggestion was referring to the former pro-Dutch region of Maluku bordering New Guinea, it was still utterly impracticable. Bernhard's subsequent role in the Bilderberg Group, set up in 1954 and focused on ending Dutch sovereignty of Netherlands New Guinea, suggests there may have been a wilier strategy behind the viceroy episode that Dulles disowned. Only months after the Netherlands transferred sovereignty of the Indies in December 1949, Indonesia changed its initial format, which was a federation, into a unitary state. There was adverse reaction in the Republic of South Maluku, which wanted to secede, and this led to armed rebellion. The rebels there mistakenly believed that they had the support of Prince Bernhard, not because of his aspirations to be viceroy, but because he offered the rebels weapons. It seemed more a case of one thing leading to another. Arms were supplied by Allen Dulles, of course, coming from the nearby Philippines and transported via NNG. So-called support for the rebellion was a political ruse. As soon as the weapons arrived, U.S. sources informed Jakarta. The reaction from Sukarno was to curse the remaining Dutch colonial presence in western New Guinea, giving the decade-long campaign a kickstart, and the loss of lives in the Republic of South Maluku was to no avail. From the British perspective, as recorded in the archives, this incident involving Prince Bernhard greatly influenced Indonesian claims to West New Guinea. Had Bernhard's aspiration to become Viceroy of the Indies proceeded before the war rather than after the war, it would definitely have had a chance of success. That is, if the alleged plan to be Viceroy had any legitimacy at all. Dulles may have been grooming him for that purpose. Replacing the Dutch colonial government in the Indies with a Viceroy would have been a coup for Standard Oil, making the Indies the Dutch equivalent of the Vichy regime in French Indochina or French Morocco. This would have opened the Indies not only to Standard Oil but to Japan and Germany, thus avoiding the war in the Pacific, but utterly changing the political profile of the Southwest Pacific. The problem is the scenario that never occurred involved Allen Dulles as much as the scenario that did occur. This gives some idea of the extraordinary person we are dealing with here. Once Hitler's armies invaded the Soviet Union, President Roosevelt's priority was for the United States to enter the war, or else be confronted by one or other of the victors of the Hitler-Stalin conflict. Allen Dulles, and John Foster Dulles even more so, became conspicuous in the late 1930s for continuing to channel American investment into German industry. In 1941, this resulted in the U.S. Justice Department launching a court case in which John Foster Dulles defended Standard Oil and the American subsidiary of IG Farben for cartel practices. Falling just short of, quote, dealing with the enemy, the fine was only $50,000. In the legal challenge mounted, it became known that Allen Dulles had arranged for Vichy France to import oil from Standard Oil, effectively selling oil to Germany when at war with America's European allies, effectively selling oil to America's enemies. As this case also involved George DeMohrenschildt, as far as back as World War II, it highlights Allen Dulles' duplicitous role in the Warren Commission. The next part moves forward to the Attorney General questioning George DeMohrenschildt in the Warren Commission. George DeMohrenschildt and Prince Bernhard were the same age. Both had claims to noble lineage in the European tradition, and both were readily influenced by Dulles' world experience and access to power. Pre-war, George still considered himself an exile, a scion of Russian and Polish nobility. The surname was held in high esteem by the émigrés in Paris and by Dulles. and also in Washington, where the name Mohrenschildt was respected in diplomatic circles. As an indication of how well known the name was, the New York Times in May of 1917 described the wedding in Washington of George's uncle Ferdinand, who was second secretary of the Russian embassy, as one of the weddings of the year. He married into the family of the Secretary of the Treasury. The bride was Miss Nona McAdoo, a nursing sister who had worked in frontline hospitals in France and Belgium. President and Mrs. Wilson attended, as well as the Vice President and Secretary of State Lansing, who was also Allen Dulles' uncle. By 1938, Allen Dulles' pre-war contacts were already extensive, and George's personable nature and multiple skills were a valuable addition. Fluency in 10 or so languages, including Flemish or Dutch, which is spoken in Belgium in addition to French, self-discipline from his experience in the Polish cavalry, as well as a postgraduate study, and with natural verve for the oil industry. George DeMohrenschildt was an ideal candidate for recruitment by Dulles. This predated any involvement of DeMohrenschildt with the CIA, which George admitted only years after Dulles' death. This was recruitment into the world of oil intelligence, the same as Dulles himself was involved when he first met George's father, Sergius, in Baku. After arriving in New York in 1938, George DeMohrenschildt lived for a while there with his brother Dmitri at 750 Park Avenue. His first job was selling perfume, as George explained to Jenner in the Warren Commission hearings. Question, Mr. DeMohrenschildt, I think as soon as I arrived, we went to spend the summer on Long Island, Bellport, Long Island. Mr. Jenner, and at Bellport you made what acquaintances? Mohrenschildt, lots of people, but especially Mrs. Bouvier. Mr. Jenner, who is Mrs. Bouvier? Mr. DeMohrenschildt, Mrs. Bouvier is Jacqueline Kennedy's mother, also her father and her whole family. She was in the process of getting a divorce from her husband. I met him also. We were very close friends. We still see each other occasionally, Mrs. Auchinloss, and occasionally correspond. Well, then I realized there was no future selling perfume, and I decided to come and try to work for an oil company. It was through Standard Oil that a link existed between Dulles and DeMohrenschildt, and this should have been brought to the attention of the Warren Commission. But of course, with Dulles playing so prominent a role, it was unlikely it would be made public. During World War II, there were two examples of DeMohrenschildt's involvement with oil and intelligence, and a third example in the 1957 to 58 period when his work involved a stint in Yugoslavia. At this time, he was representing the International Cooperation Administration, the ICA, and Jenner was fully aware of the role of the ICA in the Cold War. Established in 1955 with Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and DCI Dulles both directly involved, it was responsible for all U.S. foreign assistance programs, except military assistance and refugees. Its activities were somewhat indistinguishable from intelligence activities, and this is precisely what concerned Jenner. A letter from Allen Dulles to ICA Director John Hollister in December 1955 illustrates Jenner's concern. It clearly records, a year before DeMohrenschildt joined the ICA, so it does not refer to him, that a person on the CIA staff was included in the ICA. In the letter, DCI Dulles wrote that he was willing to release, here the CIA staffer's name was censored, on a reimbursable detail to the International Cooperation Administration for a period of approximately 2 years. And that means to release the person. This decision is made with the understanding that, name redacted, will return to this agency upon completion of his temporary tour of duty with your organization. Jenner prefaced his question to DeMohrenschildt with a deliberate choice of words. and your 1957 venture as an agent of the International Cooperation Administration. And to the question, tell us what ICA is, DeMohrenschildt replied, International Cooperation Administration here in Washington wanted an oil and gas specialist to go to Yugoslavia. He denied he was an intelligence agent, but he did admit he was shot at when he was in Yugoslavia. In 1958, his work there involved arranging Yugoslav oil workers for a job in Egypt using American equipment. Similarly, in the next country where DeMohrenschildt worked, which was Mexico, he said he was, quote, competing with the Russians. He was ideally suited for this Cold War activity, being a Russian anti-communist. But to admit to being politically involved in any way or an agent would have implicated him and any intelligence group he was linked with in the Kennedy assassination. Well, we are still in the middle of chapter 3 called Dulles, DeMohrenschildt, and Oil. We are just about to get to Standard Oil Director William Teagle and his involvement with George DeMohrenschildt, but we're going to save that for next time, and I'm going to save my voice for the next show, which will be tomorrow night. I'm going to be doing my Wednesday book reviews, and to remind you, my Wednesday book reviews are the books on the book train at screamingospreys.com. Going through each one of them one at a time, spending 1 hour to try to summarize what usually takes me 13 or 14 episodes to read the entire book or select portions of it, to summarize those so that they stay within the consciousness of our group. These are the books that I find to be the most instructive as to what the real history of our country is and my father's particular place in it, as we try to save this republic by revealing the true history of our recent times. Well, thanks again, Andy DeBala, for supplying some great graphics and always the excellent audio and video production that you do for us and also for the folks at Neighborhood News Hour. You've been helping out a lot of people and spending many hours a day working, and we do appreciate it, Andy. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone else, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.